Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of Stars, Stripes, and Sanatanis, run by second generation Hindu American teens. It's for teens, by teens. If you haven't already, please take a look at our last two episodes. I am your host, Shrikar Sadhu, and we have a new host. Would you like to introduce yourself?
What's up, homies? It's Bhuvanesh Prabhakar coming at you today with another Hindu video podcast. And so we're going to tell you today why it's never okay to make arguments that Hinduism is homophobic.
Get a load of this kid. Anyway, Bhuvanesh is right,
Of course I am.
Okay.
But seriously, I think it's absolutely horrifying that people can conflate the archaic and colonialist views of Indian culture with the inclusive thought of Sanatana Dharma, as not all Hindus are from India, and there are several extenuating circumstances surrounding those unfortunate cultural stances. I hope that we can represent the LGBTQ Hindu voice properly today, because no one should have to compromise their sexual identity or gender identity for their religious one.
I definitely agree with that statement. Love is just love. No one should be stopped or discriminated against because of who they love or their sexual identity. We should be accepting of every human, no matter how they identify.
Okay, so Shrikar over here is the straightest man I know.
I'm sorry, what?
So in order to be more authentic, we will be providing you with voices directly from the LGBTQ community.
Yes, sure. After all, use privilege to elevate, not hate.
Exactly.
Great. Let's address the elephant in the room, the Kama Sutra.
What, the book that everyone cites from The Office pretending to care about Hinduism?
Yes, that book. So just to be clear, we need to clear the air about what the scripture is and what it isn't before we go further.
It is an affirmation of the existence of multiple genders through the concept of Tritiya Prakriti, or the third sex. The concept also encompasses homosexual males, asexual people, and pansexual people.
And it is not a racy magazine.
It is a representation of lesbians, though.
Sure. They also do include the Sphyrines, who are women who engage with other women. So it seems that as early as when the Kama Sutra was created, there is evidence of these terms being included.
However, there are also other scriptures that include examples of these terms being used. It is believed for homosexuality to be set from birth, as cited in the Sushruta and Karika Samhitas. This is important because it dismisses the belief that sexual orientations that are not straight are merely for attention.
Oh, wow. So I didn't know about this, and this is definitely fascinating to know. And there should be scriptures that talk about different sexual orientations, right?
Indeed there are. Ever heard of the Purana hero Arjuna?
Oh, yeah, I have. Doesn't Arjuna describe himself as gender variance?
Yes, Arjuna does. Within the Mahabharata, a nymph named Urvasha cursed Arjuna to become a third gender. Arjuna decided to dress as a woman and named himself Brihanala. This occurred during his last year of exile.
Wonderful. However, this sounds a little bit worrisome. Was this a preposition of necessity or of identity? As in, did Arjuna do this because of this curse or in spite of it?
Alright. So my chili cheese gamer over here asked some pretty good questions. Arjuna's arc in this story, I'd imagine, is very similar to what LGBTQ youth go through. Arjuna initially viewed Brihanala as a curse, as a negative aspect of her being. However, as time passed, Arjuna used this ability as an asset, and it became part of her identity. For example, in the Padma Purana, Arjuna requested to become a woman in order to attend Krishna's mystical dance, which is exclusively for women.
Wow.
And when Krishna saw Arjuna, Krishna said, and I quote, "My dear Arjuna, you know that marriages are of many kinds. But the most wonderful of all of these is the marriage of two people in love."
Wow. After you said Krishna, that reminded me of another story.
Oh, okay. Does it involve Krishna?
Yeah, it does. In the Mahabharata, the traditional male Krishna actually turned into a woman called Mohini so that she could marry Arvan, who had little time before his voluntary sacrifice, and Krishna wanted him to experience love before that.
Inverse simp. Just kidding. Hare Krishna.
And after Arvin's death, Krishna decided to remain as a woman, mourning Arvin's death.
Oh, wow, that is fascinating. Yet sad. Our discussion today reminds me of another quote from the Sri Kaitanya Karitmrita.
Okay, what is it?
This is how it goes. One should know for certain that nothing can exist in this cosmic manifestation that has no real counterpart in the spiritual field. All material manifestations are emanations of the transcendence. The erotic principles of amorous love reflected in mixed material values are perverted reflections of the reality of spirit. But one cannot understand the reality unless one is sufficiently educated in the spiritual science.
Wow, that was a lot of information to take in. Definitely learned a lot. What does this quote mean?
In short, it means that if you're against the LGBTQ community, you're just stupid.
Got it. Very curt of you.
Yeah, I guess. All of those verbose and erudite intellectuals attempt to utilize their jargon to further confuse an audience when the paramount purpose for communication itself is ease.
Oh my god, the irony.
Yeah, congrats, man. You passed 7th grade English.
Yes, thank you. All right. Well, now I wonder if these scriptures existed, what happened in between then and now?
What do you mean?
I mean that before it seems that they were much accepting. Now it completely changed.
Oh, yeah, true. I guess that has something to do with those colonizers.
Yes, the sky is blue and we breathe O2.
You seem to exude a lot of floss and asana halipolification.
Yeah, you're just flexing now.
I have Google.
There, oh my god. Anyways, back on topic. Give me yet another reason to hate the British.
Wait. It's not just the British.
Wait, really?
Yeah. But first, we need a break.
Great.
Intrigued? Made curious? Tickled? Then check it out.
Welcome back. Also, Bhuvanesh, the word. Okay, I'm not gonna. Can you say the word, please?
Floss and asana halipolification.
Yes, that word. In that context, it just made no sense the way you said it.
Your point?
You're basically dumb.
Okay. Anyway, let's talk about the era of colonization in India. As most Hindus do exist in India, so we would be remiss to talk over colonialist influences on the views of LGBTQ of the Hindus in India.
All right. So, if I recall, the British Empire took over India, right?
Wow, great. Much knowledge. Such knowledgeable.
Dude, whatever. I'm right, though, right?
I'll leave you to your doubt.
Great. I believe that after the British came, though, the view on LGBTQ community shifted from, I think, a religious view to a more societal perception, right?
Whoa there. Let's not get too presumptuous, my guy.
What do you mean?
So let us make this clear. No matter how many examples we list today of LGBTQ symbols in Hinduism or ancient Hindu acceptance of the LGBTQ identities, the pervading religious stance on LGBTQ people in Hindu societies was largely neutral and possibly almost non-existent. The identitarian rifts that cause the hatred of LGBTQ people are purely societal, and the views of a society are partially informed by a religion.
Oh, okay. So I did not realize that, and now that makes total sense. I guess that it was always societal and that Hinduism had a neutral stance on it. Hopefully I'm correct, right?
Yeah, and this is not to throw shade at the entirety of Christianity, but there was simply more to draw from in terms of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in Christian scriptures. This is simply an empirical fact, and in no way detracts from the legitimacy of either school of thought.
Wait, that actually makes sense. And I mean, we can't label all of the religion, all of Hinduism as anti-LGBTQ just because of the rules being placed.
Yes, exactly. You finally understood.
Great. I am really dumb, as you can tell.
Anyways, when the British Empire took over the Indian subcontinent, they did not tolerate practices of homosexuality and believed that it was wrong.
Hmm. But didn't they establish it as a crime? Wasn't there like a law?
Section 377, or as I like to call it, Section 420 minus 69 plus 26.
Wow. Bhuvanesh said the funny number. Very funny, dude. You're so funny, dude. I wish I were just like you, dude. Ha ha ha. Very funny.
You are far from that.
Yeah. You never established your frame of reference, so I shall assume I am far better than that.
Okay. Anyways, getting back on topic, Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code prohibited same sex intercourse. It prohibited homosexual activity, and the punishment was. Wait, was it? What was it?
Hold on. I found the quote. So, according to 377, unnatural offenses, whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal shall be punished with imprisonment for life, or with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to 10 years, and shall also be liable to a fine. Explanation: penetration is sufficient to constitute the carnal intercourse necessary to the offense described in this section.
So, this means that the punishment is life imprisonment or for a specific term.
Yeah, so if we acknowledge the interplay of the global colonizer and its laws, as well as how the British forced their cultural and religious viewpoints on the majority of Hindu Indians, then we see so clearly that Hinduism is not to blame for the current cultural biases of Indians against LGBTQ people. The corrupt views of their ancestors just stay in their heads.
Pretty much. Due to this law, the LGBTQ community was targeted and couldn't embrace their sexuality or gender identity. Overall, it was a horrible time for them.
Okay, so I would like to take this opportunity just to say that the fault shouldn't be placed with Queen Victoria or the British Parliament, and this is coming from the fact that I like to watch a lot of shows that take place in Britain. Instead, it was the British Viceroy of India who's in charge of like governing India, along with the government in India that made these unjust laws.
I respectfully disagree with that.
Do tell why.
Those that remain complicit in idiocy are themselves misguided and incorrect. It's why I roll my eyes whenever my bhati asks to change the channel when the show depicts an LGBTQ couple. Mass campaigns ought to be carried out in both India and America to rid the world of colonist viewpoints, and they will not go away unless further decisive action is taken. My main argument is just that Hinduism itself does not contribute to the rampant homophobia. Not that there aren't absolute stupid donkeys in India that are homophobic you-know-whats.
Okay, I'm not going to argue because I definitely respect your opinion, and I definitely agree that our religion doesn't have anything against LGBTQ relationships.
In 2018, the Indian government actually lifted Code 377, saying that it was unjust. Now people are less afraid to get out of the closet and embrace who they are.
I'm not sure of that. Like, there's still social change needed, right?
Oh, yeah. Lifting this law is the first thing in creating a positive perception of LGBTQ Hindus in India, but there is still a lot of change needed before we can fully see the India that is way past the ideals placed by the British Empire.
Agreed. India needs to go back to its roots pre-colonization.
Wait, but there is a twist with regards to Hindu representation of LGBTQ peoples.
Huh?
As many have rightfully pointed out, there are homophobic Hindu scriptures that ought to be discussed. Thankfully, some of these have been iterated upon to be less homophobic. For example, the Sushruta Samhita asserts that babies that are born from two women are boneless and inherently inferior. This homophobic aspect was actually revised in a Bengali text where the love god Kama facilitated the birth of Bhagirath from the same two women in order to carry out the divine plan of the protection of the universe. Thus, not only is India, a majority Hindu nation, able to critically reflect upon its homophobic legislation, but Hindu scriptures are able to be morphed through Hindu reflection upon its previous homophobia. Furthermore, the Dharma Shastras also show this reflection, as it expressed a lack of bias against LGBTQ people, and it was written after the Sushruta Samhita.
Nice.
Now let's talk about social change.
You're jumpy today, aren't you?
It is obvious that the institution of Hindu marriage has been influenced by these increasingly accepting values. For example, in November of 2019, New Delhi had its first ever Pride Parade. In addition, an organization called the Gay and Lesbian Vaishnav Association was created to help LGBTQ Hindus deal with the social stigma against them. The mission of Galva is also to help improve their rights. Furthermore, after the Indian Supreme Court ruled that Section 377 of the Penal Code is unconstitutional, many Hindus that were part of the LGBTQ came out to the public. This shows increased support by the majority Hindu society in India. Currently, there is also an increase in the number of Hindu gay marriages.
Yay, that's amazing. I know that in Tamil Nadu and also in Kerala, they passed a policy for transgender wellness, which allows for them to get gender reassessment surgery, free housing, scholarships, and access to hospitals. Also, they created a policy that allows for members of this community to participate in the military and use whatever restroom they would like to use. Similarly, with the American Constitution, the Indian policy Holy Grail, the Constitution of India states the following in Article 15. Prohibition of discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Number 1, the state shall not discriminate against any citizen on grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. Which means that the people of the LGBT community are prohibited from discrimination in India. And that's amazing. Although in the case of Navtej Singh Tohar v. Union of India, the Supreme Court of India ruled it unconstitutional to discriminate against sexual or gender identity. However, there is no direct law that bans this discrimination word to word, which is a problem.
Shrieker, you buffoon! This is all circumstantial evidence.
What do you mean?
D. I'm just imitating the average viewer. But there is a lot of animosity towards incremental positive change amongst all marginalized groups. While I would be remiss to speak on the behalf of all LGBTQ Hindus, as one myself,
what a twist.
I can sort of attest to the frustration of incremental inaction. All of this policy change is wonderful, but we need actual social reforms. Punishment for LGBTQ bias, less normalization of LGBTQ phobic practices and microaggressions, and more information disseminated to Hindus as to why we are not a religion that endorses LGBTQ phobia are necessary for the widespread social change that we hope to achieve.
This is up to the people, though. Like, no amount of government intervention or grassroots galvanization can spur the kind of change you're talking about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right. So, like, remember when this was supposed to be an informative podcast about LGBTQ views on Hinduism and not a rant about the fertility of identitarian politics and tokenism.
HSC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization without any political affiliation.
Backpedaling, I see.
Shut up, my friend. Going back to the podcast, I know the audience doesn't want us going on a tangent about the LGBTQ Hindu community.
Yeah, what about if others did it?
Cue the interviews!
Before we cue the interviews, we should talk about our next segment. So we knew you guys would be interested in hearing first-person perspectives from Hindus in the LGBT community. So we have a special segment developed for you.
Cue Vivek!
Namaste, everybody. My likeness is Vivek Ralbandi, and I am deeply honored and gratified to be here. I hail from the town of Edison, New Jersey, and I once again must express how grateful I am to be here. What a wonderful experience that has been granted upon me. You both are wonderful individuals. Truly, some of the best individuals. Dare I say, the best individuals. Anyway, I'm going to be interacting with a myriad of LGBTQ Hindus, and I will be asking a number of poignant questions about the LGBTQ community and its stance within and surrounding Hindu Dharma.
Take it away, Vivek.
All right, so it's my pleasure to be joined for today's interview segment by two very special guests, Bhuvanesh and Pavel, and I'm truly grateful to them for taking the time to join us on our podcast on this episode of Stars, Stripes, and Sanatanis to talk about this issue from a more personal perspective. We talk about a lot of things in the abstract, and we can do all kinds of academic analysis and we can look at it from all of these different lenses. But to get a personal perspective from individuals who have experience in this field because they have lived this experience is something truly something that is irreplaceable and something that we're very grateful to have. So thank you so much, Bhuvanesh and Pavel, for joining us today. All right. So I'm envisioning this interview being more of a discussion-based format rather than me asking questions and getting answers. I did provide the questions that I was thinking about asking in advance. Because of the sensitivity of the subject, I thought that it was good that our guests have a sneak peek of what it is that we would be discussing on today's podcast. I wanted to start off with this question, and just to sort of set the stage, I think, before we really delve into the aspect of Hinduism necessarily, how has and I would want to start with this question: how has your identity as a member of the LGBTQ plus community influenced your life as a whole? And that could be related to Hinduism, that could be related to other things in general, but how do you feel it influences your life and your identity in general? Either one of you can start and take that question.
So I guess I can go first. Namaste, everybody. You all saw me before. I am Bhuvanesh once again. And I think that my answer to this question is that it sort of doesn't. I mean, the thing about identifying as LGBTQ is that it largely influences your perception about yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think sort of feeling comfortable with yourself. And I think once you've passed that threshold, it really is more of like a eureka moment. And then it sort of fades into something that exists in your mind, but it's not something that you have to actively think about because it's something that you've already kind of internalized. So my answer to that question is it doesn't really impact my life at large that much. It's not like I wear like a sign on my forehead saying like, hey, I am LGBTQ and this means X, Y, and Z. Like, I'm not closeted about it. I'm very open about it. But I think that it's not really something that affects some core aspects of my life, like my academics or my extracurriculars, such that it would be something that I would say impacts my life at large to a large degree.
Right, because at the end of the day, we all are who we are, right? I mean, regardless of any sort of aspect of our identity, we are ourselves. So I think that's a very insightful perspective. We'll have to hear your take on this also, Dhaval. What would you have to say with respect to that?
Yeah, so I totally agree with what Bhuvanesh has just said. Being LGBTQ plus is not something that can be found within you physically at all. So as he said, I'm not wearing a sign saying I'm LGBTQ plus at all. I'm closeted myself, so not many people know about my identity. But I would say that I have struggled internally, as Bhuvanesh said, about reconciling my identity internally with what society presents at large, the heteronormativity per se, because I come from a particular sexual orientation. And so personally, it's always been an inner conflict and not necessarily something that affects my day-to-day, my academics or my interactions with other people. It is a very mental game, and I would have to add on to the fact that there are a lot of stereotypes, and I think this may come on later in the discussion, that are projected on LGBTQ plus identities. And growing up, I always felt that I had to kind of reject those stereotypes, or I was always on the lookout of whether I could be detected as being LGBTQ plus, and that would affect my identity. But so far it hasn't, so it's largely been a private affair. And whoever I'm comfortable with or close to, I reveal to them And it, uh, apart from the initial conversation of, oh, so how has it been your entire life? It hasn't really affected my interactions with them anymore.
Right.
It's been kind of a 5-10 minute conversation, comes up here and now and again, more empathy, and then moves on. No one really thinks twice about it.
Right. And so I think Pavel, you actually sort of took me into my next question, and I really appreciate your answer to that, because I think sort of if you look at both Bhuvanesh's and Pavel's response, if you look at both of your responses to that question, I think one of the sort of points that comes up when you look at it is it's often a very personal decision, right? In terms of how open do you want to be, or who do you necessarily want to share that with? And it's a very personal decision, as I can understand, not from my own experience, but I can understand based on what the two of you are saying. And I think Pavel talked a little bit about sort of how his interactions have been with people that have that he's conveyed it to within his close circles. But so I wanted to ask you, Bhuvanesh, sort of in the same vein, because you mentioned that you were pretty open about your identity. So in that sense, I mean, how did your family, your friends, your Hindu community at large, how did they how have people sort of reacted by and large to you sharing this with them, and has it been sort of a spectrum of reactions, and what are some of the things that you've kind of come up against or encountered, and what do you think that sort of reflects about the perceptions of society at large, and particularly the Hindu community with respect to the LGBTQ plus community?
I mean, the two words that I've gotten most of the time are just like, okay, cool. I mean, I feel like the people around me and the people whom I interact with in Hindu Students' Council and other Hindu areas, I mean, I don't think that people are like actively like care too much. You'll have one or two people that ask questions because they want to sort of know more. I don't think it's any malicious intent. I haven't really faced any backlash for identifying as LGBTQ, partially because I'm open about it, but it's also something where ask me and I'll tell you, not something where like I'll go out and just be like, hey, this is what I am, because it's like on a need to know basis kind of sort of thing.
Right.
So like obviously the people whom I know for a fact would incur backlash, Hindu or not, are not going to be privy to the information unless they have to be. But I think that it's largely as Hindus, the Hindu people that I've told have all been very accepting, because there's nothing that religiously mandates, as we went on in length previously, there's nothing that religiously mandates that they sort of have this bias towards LGBTQ individuals. And I think that sort of I don't feel like anybody's out to get me, basically. I mean, I also came out relatively recently, so perhaps that is subject to change, but I don't think as of now that anybody's really out to get me, or that I have to be sort of worried about like, oh no, am I going to be able to survive to the next day? Like I feel incredibly grateful for that, because I'm sort of in this really supportive community. But like I think that on the whole, as Hindus or not, I've been treated relatively humanely.
I think that's something very heartening to hear, because I don't really think it should be sort of influenced by religion or influenced by anything else for that matter. The fact that you treat a person as a person regardless of what they identify as, or regardless of who they are, I think that's a universal value, not a religious one. Certainly it's embodied by Hinduism, it's embodied by our Sanatana Dharma, but it's not some sort of religiously dictated thing. I think it's just being a good person, essentially. So I think going off of this, and I think Bhuvanesh, you talked about sort of, I think you touched on a very good point with respect to Hinduism and LGBTQ, the LGBTQ community, and how Hinduism sort of deals with it, and that's the subject of our entire podcast at large. Did you Pavel and Bhuvanesh ever sort of, I mean, not struggle with, but ever necessarily think about, or ever look at how to balance maybe your identity as a Hindu or as a LGBTQ Q plus community member. Was that something that ever you felt came into conflict, or did you feel that the two sort of just complemented one another from the get-go? How was that sort of journey for the both of you? Why don't we start with you, Tawal, on this one?
Yeah, sure. So, in fact, I remember very vividly. I was around the age of 13 to 14, and there was a textbook called Hinduism for Schools, and I wasn't firmly fixated on my identity then. I still had questions about sexuality, etc. But
Right.
in that textbook, it's written by the late J. Lakhani, the physicist and the renowned Hindu communicator of the UK. And in that textbook, he touched upon the idea of homosexuality, and he came on it from a stance of reincarnation, and that quite fascinated me when I heard of it, because I was getting more comfortable with Hindu concepts at that time,
Right.
and the idea that reincarnation could explain why one would be homosexual, bisexual, across the spectrum of sexuality, or or across the spectrum of gender, due to changes in gender and due to changes in attraction over lifetimes. And I found that concept quite interesting, that it could be explained in this way, and this was something unique. And as I kind of grew, as I got older, I came across the famed texts of Shikhandi, Ira, Mohini, Mitra, Varuna, etc. in the Puranas and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And I looked at these texts and I thought, damn, I haven't seen anyone interpret them in an LGBTQ plus narrative. Later I found Devdutt Patnaik had, and many others, among many others. And so I thought, okay, well, there's no explicit mention of a particular identity or a particular transformation, but there are some references within the texts, and those references are enough for me to validate my own identity as I grew. But
absolutely, yeah.
Also, there was a sort of a cultural dissonance with the religious acknowledgement. So culturally, it's very heteronormative, and so that was quite difficult for me to reconcile in my head, because religiously there are references. You can talk about the Atman, and spiritually things are fine, but in the cultural context, things were different, and that's where there was an issue. But it wasn't a major issue. It was mainly, as far as I can remember, I was just concerned about whether my friend would still accept me at that level. And then after that was fine. It was more, okay, what about my family? And that's something I've not had that conversation with them, but it is something that will take time.
Absolutely. I think that was a very, very insightful answer. I really appreciate you sharing that, Tawal. And I think one of the points that you mentioned with respect to the sort of dichotomy between culture and religion, I think, is a very, very important point to note, because I think religiously speaking, if you're looking at it, and even with the examples that Tawal named, and also the entire discussion that occurred over the course of this podcast, it's not so much a religious issue, but rather a cultural one. And now, with respect to our sort of Indian the culture and the Sanatana Dharma, the roots of Sanatana Dharma, they're intertwined. They're intertwined, highly intertwined. But at the same time, they're what is necessarily mandated or sort of spelled out religiously doesn't automatically translate to what you see culturally. And I guess in a lot of respects, maybe I think perhaps culture may be more regressive than religion. I think this is certainly one of those examples. Bhuvanesh, do you want to have a take on this sort of maybe balancing your identity as an LGBTQ plus community member and a Hindu, or do you feel that they complement each other? Or did you ever struggle with that sort of balancing them, or what is your experience with that?
A lot of the identities brought about in the modern LGBTQ movement are sort of these names that have emerged in the last 20 to 30 years.
Right.
And I'm not really discounting this nomenclature. It's incredibly useful for sort of defining what you are and who you are. And I think that Hinduism just doesn't have that nomenclature. I think to say that, okay, there are no explicit references is to say that there's like terms for every single sexuality or gender identity that we've sort of defined now back then, but they were still represented, right? So I think that empirically and also generally, I think that there's no real struggle for me to reconcile both identities, especially because they're both sort of so ingrained in my worldview that there's no difference to me. They're kind of the same. I mean, they both sort of just encompass who I am and what I believe, and so I don't really have much to add other than I think that they complement each other, as you asked. I think they're cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's I'm very glad to hear, in terms of the religious sense, in terms of the Hindu sense, the sense of Hindu religion, the fact that maybe these things were not explicitly spelled out, and that's been a more sort of modern evolution in terms of actually defining different points on the spectrum with respect to the LGBTQ community, but in terms of the core ideal, that's been recognized by Hinduism, and that has been something that has happened for millennia. Like with respect to the examples that Dhaval referred to, for instance, So I think we've established through this podcast, this entire podcast, as well as this interview, even specifically with respect to the recognition that Hinduism provides for the LGBTQ, the identity of being LGBTQ plus. But I think it's unquestionable, and I think both of you would agree that there are still sort of many Hindus, both, I think, across, whether that be in India or whether that be throughout the globe, that do harbor certain stereotypes about the LGBTQ plus community, and having lived that experience and living that experience as someone who identifies as part of the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, what would your message be to individuals like that? Because I think what happens is that you read about all kinds of things and you hear about all kinds of things, but oftentimes people might not know someone personally that identifies as LGBTQ, and that person, and the person knows that this individual identifies. So it's not a personal thing, but rather it's just a very impersonal, remote thing, and people have all kinds of misconceptions and all these notions. But I think now they have the opportunity, whoever's listening to this podcast has an opportunity to hear directly from you. So what would your message be to Hindus that are in that position? And either of you could take that, start off.
So statistically, right, I'm going to focus more on the Hindu diaspora, or Hindu diaspora to North America, because that's what I have experience with, right? So statistically, most of that diaspora is people from India. That's just kind of where most of the Hindus coming here come from.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
And so I think that obviously there's a lot of homophobia and LGBTQ bias in India itself. I'm not going to discount that. And I think that here it sort of becomes worse because a lot of kids, right, they sort of see these other communities with like different sort of ingrained identities, and we sort of just take like we sort of have that sort of identity crisis of like whether we're like American or Indian. And so I think that we also sort of adapt a lot of like that internalized homophobia, westernized internalized homophobia. I think we sort of adapt that as well, which kind of causes a little bit of a problem in the diaspora. I can't really speak much for India because I mean I don't really like know too many people that live in India. But in terms of the diaspora here, I mean, it's just the typical stuff, right? Like you just hear people calling everything gay all the time when it's really like that's not what they mean to say. They mean to say it very derogatorily, and very critically. Right. And so I think that that's kind of the main thing that I'd see here that's happening. And I think that like it's just that stereotype that these like all gay people are like feminine or just completely adept and like socially awkward. And I think that these are all stereotypes that are negatively contributing to society, obviously. And I think that in order to sort of get rid of them in the Hindu community or otherwise, there just has to be more education and also a greater consequence for those that choose not to have the correct view on the situation, which is that all human beings should be judged equally and that gender and sexuality do not have any sort of stereotypes that should be associated with them.
Absolutely. Talal, what would your take with respect to this? And I think, being from the UK and Bhuvanesh being from the United States, I think it provides a bit of a difference in regional perspective. I'd love to hear about that too. Any sort of similarities and differences that you might have to provide based on sort of your life experiences and where you're situated.
Sure. So in terms of the UK, the Hindu diaspora with regards to LGBTQ issues is largely silent. It kind of brushes these issues under the carpet. You don't see many LGBTQ plus Hindus that are out and proud in the community. And if they are, they will be more those that may align with those stereotypes, quote unquote.
Right.
And so they will be ridiculed in conversations by the older generations that are from India. However, in the younger generations, as Bhuvanesh said, and it's very much the case here, this internalized homophobia from the West has been imported within the younger generation. So younger Indians, they themselves, who may identify as LGBTQ plus, don't come out, and they do resort to underground gay cultures, which may not be very healthy for them. And this includes, speaking from the UK perspective, I'm sure there are some in the States. This includes perverted practices of tantra, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that the gay scene, quote unquote, for Hindus in particular, has become quite underground, and it unfortunately can be the breeding ground of very unhealthy sort of ideals and lifestyles. So my message to the Hindu diaspora in the UK and the West at large would be that we are currently dealing with many issues in our intersectionality with being Hindu and with being LGBTQ+. And I think one of the most, from my opinion, one of the most fundamental sort of dichotomies that exist are the idea of a secure family unit, which is very prevalent amongst the Hindu diaspora, and the LGBT lifestyle, which is not having a family, being in promiscuous relationships and not taking responsibility, etc., along with those stereotypes. And I'm not saying that, not invalidating that at all. Though that does occur because family support is not there. So what my message would be is any of those individuals who are kind of out and proud with their sexuality and their gender identity to become more exemplary within the community, so that other younger LGBTQ individuals do take inspiration from them, and so do other general members of the Hindu diaspora see that they can be compatible with society. And I'm not saying that compatibility with society is absolutely necessary, but to perpetuate a healthy and a more inclusive ideal of what an LGBTQ plus person could be, for those individuals to inspire and to educate, more importantly, as Bhuvanesh said. So I think there just needs to be a perspective shift on how people view LGBTQ plus individuals, and perhaps, and I know this is quite a bit to ask, but a bit too much to ask, but perhaps religious organizations, sampradayas can sort of try to not ignore these issues but tackle them within the UK and the States, and it's hard because they come from a different generation, but it would work better, because if it's coming from an authoritative figure or an organization, then the older generation and the younger generation are likely to listen. So
absolutely. Thank you so much to you both for that. The answer to that question. I think we're definitely seeing some positive signs. I think there's definitely progress as a whole in terms of acceptance and of the LGBTQ community. And I think this broader message of accepting an individual as an individual, as a person, because and recognizing the common humanity. And I think that's an intrinsically Hindu principle. that should continue to endure, and I hope that in the years and decades to come that this continues to progress further, both in general and also specifically with respect to our Hindu community. And I think with respect to Hinduism in particular, I think once people sort of understand this essential concept of Hinduism and understand how Hinduism is, straight in line with this sort of acceptance, hopefully change their views also, and those who still harbor some of these stereotypes and misconceptions. So we will conclude with that, but I just wanted to conclude this interview, this segment, by saying, thank you so much, Bhuvanesh and Tavel, for coming on to share your experiences, to share your thoughts, which are born of not merely academic study, but also personal experience, which we are truly grateful that you're offering our listeners. So thank you so much, Bhuvanesh and Tavel, for your time today.
It was a pleasure being here, my friend.
Thank you so much for having a perspective from the UK. It's been a great opportunity.
Thank you. We're trying to create a wonderful cult.
Ecosystem. Environment.
Cult.
Humanity's major cesspool of death.
Sure.
Well, what Vivek was trying to say is that we want to cultivate a vibrant space for Hindu American teenagers, and in doing so, we ask you to follow at HSC High School on Instagram. I repeat, at HSC High School on Instagram. Subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you guys are listening to, and keep track of events.
Yes. Okay, bye.
No, we're not done. There are some things we need to say. For example, before we leave, we should leave our audience with an interesting question to think about, like we do in the last episodes and in every episode. Bhuvanesh or Vivek, do you guys have any questions that we should ask our audience?
Think about your biases. Have you ever thought or said something discriminatory to LGBTQ people? Can you truly justify these thoughts or actions using Hindu Dharma? Or are you just an individual in need of improvement?
Ponder upon your heteronormative privilege. What small or large steps can you take to assist individuals in the Hindu LGBTQ community against archaic colonialist discrimination or just bad influences in general?
Good question. Also, if you see anyone being discriminated against because of their identity, remember to stand up and speak out. And finally, exercise your First Amendment right of free speech. We can change these perspectives one voice at a time.
I stand in agreement with your awesome assertion. Truly inspiring.
Thanks. So the next episode is actually going to be very interesting. Every 5 episodes, we will have a recording of a Charcha chat that was done within the Hindu Students Council. Definitely give it a listen because there are some interesting and insightful perspectives about present day topics and its relation to Hinduism. This is definitely going to be an interesting episode, and we hope to see you next week on Sunday at 4 p.m. EST.
Yes, please interestingly attend our interesting presentation.
Please, oh my God.
Let's close with a relatively standardized outro.
Okay, bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stars, Stripes, and Sanatanis, Young Hindu Voices of America. Namaste.
Namaste.